blessing of returning to loved places. Alhamdulillah. The trip to South Africa was especially to Cape Town, which is a very blessed place, was a reminder of what it takes to preserve the deen. Islam entered the Cape Town in South Africa by historical accident. The Dutch had taken over what was called the East Indies, the Malay archipelago, and many Muslim leaders were at the forefront of the opposition to that Dutch rule. And what could you do with them? So a number of them, of these leaders, were shipped out because they're so prominent you couldn't exactly kill them. So they shipped them out. And amongst those who were shipped out, and the first great Muslim, probably the first Muslim who was sent to the Cape, was Sheikh Yusuf Makassar, from Makassar in what's now Indonesia. And he was a distinguished scholar and a man of the spiritual path. He was khalwati amongst other spiritual paths. And even on the boat to the Cape, some of his jailers had become Muslim. I met at the house of Sheikh Ali Khalfi. I met his father-in-law, who's of Dutch origin. His great-great-grandfather was one of the jailers on the boat that brought Sheikh Yusuf Makassar from Indonesia to the Western Cape, and his ancestor became Muslim on the boat. And then once they landed, he fled army service and actually joined up with Sheikh Yusuf Makassar. And even the governor of the Cape, when he saw Sheikh Yusuf Makassar land, he said, "This is a man of God. We should kind of leave him alone." So they put him in exile in a place outside what's now Cape Town called Makassar, named after where he came from. And they gave him some land, but then the slaves used to flee and go and study with him. And then later waves of scholars came, amongst them the one who established the first mosque certainly in the Western Cape, arguably in South Africa. There was discussion on that. A sheikh known as Tuan Guru, the first teacher, he established a masjid, very simply called Masjid Awal, the first mosque. And it's an amazing history, and we'll be sharing some lessons from it, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. But he too was a political refugee. Tuan Guru actually was a student, amongst others, of Sheikh Ibrahim al-Qurani, who was one of the teachers of Shah Waliullah al-Dahlawi. All the Indian isnads in ilm, particularly in hadith, go back to Shah Waliullah al-Dahlawi. Shah Waliullah studied in the Hijaz, in Mecca and Medina, and one of his main teachers was Sheikh al-Qurani, and he was one of the teachers of Tuan Guru. Tuan Guru also studied under Imam al-Haddad. And when exiled to Cape Town itself, he was not allowed to come with any books, not even a Quran. So they did a number of amazing things. One of the things was, Tuan Guru, while in exile, he married and settled, but he had to teach his own children. So he wrote out the Mus'haf, and they have the actual text at Masjid Awal. Wrote it out by hand, and it's dead on accurate. There's just like a couple of little slips in tashkil, which is pretty incredible. And that's how they preserved the Quran. Of course, he had memorized it, so he was teaching it from memory, but also wrote it out for his own children and for others. But they were not allowed, before that, from the time of Sheikh Yusuf Makassar, they were not allowed to practice. But one of the things that was instituted, they used to gather and recite adhkar. And from the time of Tuan Guru, one of the things they used to recite was the ratib of Imam al-Haddad. But they weren't it was so intense they couldn't just gather and recite it normally. So they, the Dutch and then the British were religious people, and they kind of let. And there's actually, the Dutch were very intense. They did not allow even other denominations of Christianity to practice. So they adopted certain hymnal tones to recite the Ratib of Imam al-Haddad. So if you listen to it, you would think it was a hymn. But it's actually exactly the Ratib of Imam al-Haddad, but in a way that, if a soldier is passing by or whatever, you think, oh, these are just a bunch of slaves chanting a hymn. So they let them be. So that's how they preserved the adhkar and different du'as and so on in intense opposition. And subsequent waves of ulama came. And that's one of the, we were talking to Sheikh Siraj Hendricks, who himself has a fascinating history, that the deen was preserved above all by maintaining the spiritual connection of the community of Muslims to Quran and to dhikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And it was renewed by scholars. And there's very limited facility for to actually produce local scholars, but there was still transmission of deen, that even in the most adverse circumstances, they were teaching. And other scholars who came, it's one of the interesting things about Cape Town, it's around a cape, that encircling Cape Town are 26 or 27 maqams, the burial sites of these great righteous scholars. They're known as karamat. Even in Afrikaans, called karamat. Because it's known, these are places of miracles. But you'd wonder why, if they were imprisoned, they were captured, and they were in Cape Town itself, why were the graves all around? And the reason was that even in captivity, they would go, because you have to give your prisoners break times. So they would go into the mountains, and their students, who were by and large slaves, would flee into the mountains to be able to study the deen and gain religious guidance. So all these karamat, and they're not just outside the city, they're all tucked, there's one sheikh called Sheikh Nurul Mubin, and I was saying, couldn't they just bury him at the bottom of the hill? Because it's called the 100 steps, or the 99 steps. I guess it depends if you count the first one. It's way up there. And these are not regular steps. They're steps for people with himmah. Because they're... And it's way up there. Why? And there's actually some of his students are buried higher up the mountain. We didn't go that high up. But because this is the struggle to preserve the deen. They weren't sitting and saying, okay, let's be comfortable and make sure the cooling's at the right temperature. And, real struggle. But as a result, more than 300 years, right? Islam was preserved in the Cape, and these practices are, their practice of the deen remains from that time. These masajid from that time, like Masjid Awwal and other masajid that were established in those generations, still remain operating. And there's a very rich and nuanced culture of learning and gatherings of remembrance, etc., that they have. Of course, every community has its challenges, but this was one of the major lessons. Even others, Sheikh Siraj Hendricks, whom we met, who's one of the senior scholars there with one of their national councils of scholars, at the Zawiya Mosque, his ancestors embraced Islam. His ancestry is partially Dutch and partially Cape Malay. one of the first things, one of the scholars who came from outside said regarding one of his great grandfathers, he noticed concern for deen in him. He ordered that, he should be dedicated to deen. So for several generations now, Sheikh Siraj Hendricks' family has been going overseas to study and coming back as ulama. So in this generation, Sheikh Siraj Hendricks and his older brother Sheikh Ahmed, Hafidhahumullah, they both went and spent over 10 years studying under Sheikh Muhammad Alawi al-Maliki in the Hijaz, and then they came back. And now Sheikh Siraj's son, whom we met and I tackled 5 times, alhamdulillah, twice in front of his dad, actually 3 times in front of his dad. He's in Egypt studying, right? So this concern for the preservation of deen and guidance is one of the big lessons there. And alhamdulillah alladhi bi ni'matihi tatimmu as-salihat. وصلى الله على سيدنا ونبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. ربنا تقبل منا إنك أنت السميع العليم وتب علينا إنك أنت التواب الرحيم. اللهم ثبتنا على القول الثابت في الحياة الدنيا وفي الآخرة يا رب العالمين، وأتممنا لنا مقاصدنا. اللهم ارحمنا وارحم أمة سيدنا محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم كافة يا رب العالمين، وادفع عنهم كل شر ويسر لهم كل خير من خير الدنيا والآخرة على ما فيه رضاك وقربك ومحبتك يا رب العالمين. اللهم أحينا وأمتنا على نهج النبي المصطفى صلى الله عليه وسلم، وصلي وسلم وبارك عليه وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم، والحمد لله رب العالمين.